Attack was an attack just over a week ago on a commuter train in Portland, where basically Jeremy Christian threatened a young Muslim girl and her friend.
Division versus Smith, which at the time the ACLU called the Dred Scott of the First Amendment. Because
LGBT community, just in this legislative session alone, that's 12 weeks, 200 bills. And the truth is,
in a democracy, a free press, historically, and I think still today, is the major mechanism that we count on to gather information and disseminate information. I mean, those are the functions. And from a cultural standpoint, that has all kinds of importance. From a core political standpoint, the press is the entity that is charged with keeping us all informed about what's going on. Reporting on a complicated piece of social policy legislation is really hard and really important, and that's what the journalistic profession, in my mind, from a democratic standpoint, that's the greatest value that the journalistic profession adds to our public discourse. Without that, without a strong, free, independent press, we are still going to have a lot of commentary. We're still going to have a lot of opinions flying around, but those opinions will not be grounded in widely available, verifiable, contestable information, and it'll just be a bunch of people yelling at each other.
I've heard enough about Black history. That's all they talk about in the schools and run my people down.
What school is that? What school are they talking about? Tell me some Black history.
Let me ask you about Abraham Lincoln. What do you think? Do you think he's a great emancipator? Did he end slavery? Is that what you think?
Well, who did? If he did.
No, I'm asking you a question. Do you think that Abraham Lincoln ended slavery?
Who wrote the legislation?
He didn't. The only thing Abraham Lincoln did was end slavery in the South. He kept slavery in the North. The Civil War was a war of northern aggression, plain and simple. He had no moral high ground. He was no great emancipator. He was a tyrant, sick of a tyrant.
Strengthen the hand of law enforcement, strengthening, increasing penalties for engaging in these kinds of protests. The worst of these pieces of legislation is one out of North Dakota that says if you run over somebody who's protesting in the street, as long as it's accidental, you're not going to be liable for that, which is literally a license to kill. Now, there's a big legal problem with this legislation, with all of these pieces of legislation, and that is that no matter how they're worded, no matter how neutrally they appear to be, no matter how neutrally they're dressed up, they are targeting protest activities in particular. And that's not lawfully okay. I mean, this is not rocket science. This is not controversial. This is, again, this is 1776. This is basic, historically grounded, pedigreed protest of the kind that we think of as an important part of our national self-concept. And we've got state legislatures trying.
Employment Division versus Smith, which at the time the ACLU called the Dred Scott of the First Amendment, because it basically meant you don't have very many constitutional protections for the free exercise of religion. And since that date, since the early 90s, most protection for religious freedom has happened.
So that we can recognize the institutional pieces that are in place that allow that to happen and sustain those things and encourage them. Promote education that gives people a sense of their stakes in the political process. Create opportunities, open up public spaces like university campuses that give people a forum for making their views known. These positive elements of freedom of expression, I think, don't get talked about nearly enough. And all of these things that we're talking about have that facet to them. The free press, street protests, activist students, all of these kinds of activity and others like them from every conceivable ideological perspective. This is what the First Amendment was designed to do.